It was a Friday night, and after a grueling week at work, I decided to unwind with a late-night movie. The theater I chose was an old, nostalgic spot in the city, one of those places that had been around for decades, with its slightly faded marquee and creaky seats. I'd been there a few times before, and I liked the atmosphere. It had a certain charm, despite being a bit run down. That night, the theater was almost empty, which I didn't mind. There were only a handful of people scattered throughout the rows, and I picked a seat near the back where I could have a good view of the screen and the entire theater. The dim lights, the faint smell of popcorn, and the hushed whispers of the few patrons created a quiet, almost serene environment. The movie began without incident. For the first 30 minutes, everything was normal. I was engrossed in the film, enjoying the solitude that the near-empty theater provided. But then, something changed. I began to feel a strange sensation, as if someone was watching me. Not just a casual glance, but a focused, intense stare. I brushed it off at first, thinking I was being paranoid. But the feeling grew stronger, gnawing at the back of my mind. I glanced around, trying to catch someone's eye, but everyone was facing forward, absorbed in the movie. My eyes drifted to the projection booth, and that's when I saw it. A dark figure standing behind the glass, staring directly at me. The figure was completely still, and I couldn't make out any details, but I felt a chill run down my spine. I tried to focus on the movie, but my eyes kept drifting back to the projection booth. The figure hadn't moved. It just stood there, watching. My heart began to race, and I started to feel increasingly uneasy. Who was that? Why were they staring at me? I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. I thought about getting up and leaving, but I didn't want to draw attention to myself. I told myself that it was probably just a staff member, maybe a bored employee passing the time. But the way the figure stood there, completely motionless, sent shivers down my spine. It didn't feel right. It felt like I was being singled out, like whoever or whatever was up there was fixated on me. As the movie continued, the atmosphere in the theater began to change. The sound from the speakers started to muffle, and the screen seemed to dim, as if the life was being drained out of the room. I looked around again, and this time, I noticed something even more disturbing. The other moviegoers were sitting completely still, unnaturally so. No one was moving, not even to adjust their seats or check their phones. It was as if they were frozen in place. My pulse quickened, and I could feel a cold sweat forming on my forehead. I turned my gaze back to the projection booth, but the figure was gone. Relief washed over me for a moment, but the oppressive atmosphere remained, making me feel trapped. Then, without warning, the screen flickered, and the movie cut out entirely, plunging the theater into darkness. The silence that followed was deafening, the kind that presses in on your ears and makes your own breathing sound loud. My eyes struggled to adjust to the darkness, and for a few moments I sat there, frozen, trying to make sense of what was happening. Then I heard it, a faint sound, like someone or something moving behind me. It was subtle at first, just a rustling, but then it grew louder, more distinct. Footsteps. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized the sound was getting closer. I turned in my seat, straining to see through the darkness. But there was nothing there, just shadows and the faint glow of the emergency exit sign. I reached for my phone, desperate to use its flashlight. But to my horror, the screen wouldn't turn on. It was as if the battery had drained completely, despite being nearly full when I'd arrived at the theater. Panic surged through me, and I knew I needed to get out of there. I stood up, trying to move quietly, but every step I took seemed to echo through the empty theater. The footsteps behind me grew louder, and I could feel the presence getting closer, like a shadow looming over me. I forced myself to keep moving, each step feeling like it took an eternity. The exit sign glowed faintly ahead, a beacon of safety in the suffocating darkness. My only thought was to reach it before whatever was behind me did. Just as I reached the aisle leading to the exit, there was a loud crash behind me, followed by the sound of something heavy hitting the floor. I didn't dare look back. I bolted for the exit, my heart pounding so hard I could barely breathe. The door to the lobby felt like a lifeline, and I pushed it open with all my strength, bursting out into the brightly lit lobby. The sudden light was blinding, but the familiar sounds of the concession stand and the faint hum of the vending machines were a stark contrast to the terror I had just experienced. But when I looked around, the lobby was empty. The lights were on, but there was no one there. The silence was eerie, as if the theater had been abandoned. I didn't stop running until I was outside, the cool night air hitting me like a splash of cold water. I stood there, panting, trying to catch my breath as I looked back at the theater. The neon sign flickered, casting a dim, ghostly glow over the entrance. I half expected to see the dark figure standing in the doorway, watching me, but there was nothing. Just the empty building, silent and still. I couldn't shake the feeling that something unnatural had happened in that theater, something that defied explanation. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what I had just experienced, but the more I thought about it, the more confused I became. I never went back to that theater. I didn't even finish the movie for days. The feeling of being watched lingered, even in the safety of my own home. Every shadow, every creak of the floorboards made me jump, and I couldn't shake the sense of dread that had taken hold of me. I tried to rationalize it, to tell myself that it was all in my head. But deep down, I knew that something had been wrong in that theater. Whatever it was that watched me from the projection booth wasn't human, and it had left a mark on me that I couldn't erase. To this day, I avoid late-night screenings and old theaters. I don't know what I encountered that night, and I never want to find out. It was a cold winter evening, and I had just finished dinner with a few friends when we decided to catch a late-night movie at the local theater. The theater was one of those small, independently owned places that showed a mix of old classics and new releases. It was a place that had a lot of character, with creaky floors and the faint smell of buttered popcorn that seemed to seep into every corner. We chose a thriller that had just come out, a movie that promised to be intense and suspenseful. As we bought our tickets and made our way inside, I noticed that the theater was unusually empty. It was just the three of us, and a few other people scattered throughout the rows. We found seats near the middle, where we had a clear view of the screen, but were still close enough to feel immersed in the experience. As the lights dimmed and the previews began, I noticed a man entering the theater alone. He was wearing a bright red jacket, which stood out against the dark, muted tones of the theater. He walked down the aisle slowly, almost deliberately, and took a seat near the front off to the side. I didn't think much of it at first, but something about his presence felt off. He didn't seem to be watching the screen. Instead, he kept glancing around the theater, as if he was looking for something or someone. As the movie started, I tried to focus on the story, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled over me. Every now and then, I would glance toward the man in the red jacket. He was still sitting there, but his eyes weren't on the screen. They were scanning the audience, moving from one person to the next, before settling on me. When our eyes met, I quickly looked away, but the sense of unease only grew stronger. I whispered to my friend next to me, asking if they noticed the man, but they just shrugged it off, telling me to relax and enjoy the movie. As the movie progressed, the tension in the theater seemed to grow. The scenes on the screen were intense, filled with suspense and fear, but the real tension came from the man in the red jacket. I could feel his gaze on me, even when I wasn't looking at him. At one point, I glanced over and saw that he had shifted in his seat, leaning slightly toward the aisle, as if preparing to stand up. My heart began to race, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Something about his behavior was deeply unsettling, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was in danger. About halfway through the movie, the man in the red jacket stood up. He didn't move immediately, just stood there for a moment as if deciding what to do next. Then, without any warning, he started walking up the aisle, slowly at first, but with increasing speed. My friends and I exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what was happening. The other people in the theater didn't seem to notice him, or if they did, they were pretending not to. As he approached our row, I felt a surge of panic. I didn't know what he was planning to do, but every instinct in my body told me to get out of there. As the man reached our row, he suddenly stopped and turned to face us. His expression was blank, almost vacant, but there was something in his eyes that sent a jolt of fear through me. He didn't say anything, just stood there, staring at us with an intensity that made my skin crawl. My friends and I froze, unsure of what to do. The theater was so quiet that I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. After what felt like an eternity, the man finally turned and walked back down the aisle, exiting the theater without looking back. The door closed softly behind him, leaving us in stunned silence. The rest of the movie passed in a blur. I couldn't focus on the screen, my mind racing with thoughts of what had just happened. Who was that man? Why had he been watching us? As the credits began to roll, my friends and I quickly gathered our things and headed for the exit. The theater lobby was empty, and the night outside was cold and still. As we stepped out into the icy air, I couldn't shake the feeling that the man in the red jacket was still out there, watching us from the shadows. As we walked to our car, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the man following us. The parking lot was mostly empty, with just a few cars scattered around. We reached our car and hurried inside, locking the doors behind us. As we pulled out of the lot, I felt a sense of relief, but it was short-lived. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw a figure standing at the edge of the lot, partially obscured by the darkness. It was the man in the red jacket. He was just standing there, watching us as we drove away. The drive home was tense and silent. None of us spoke, each of us lost in our own thoughts, trying to process what had happened. When we finally reached my friend's house, we sat in the car for a few moments, still shaken by the night's events. We tried to laugh it off, convincing ourselves that the man was just some weirdo. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. There was something wrong about him, something dangerous. As I drove home alone, the sense of dread grew stronger. I couldn't shake the feeling that he had followed us, that he knew where I lived. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the man in the red jacket standing outside my window, watching me with those cold, vacant eyes. The next morning, I woke up to find my front door slightly ajar, even though I was sure I had locked it the night before. My heart raced as I checked the house, but nothing seemed to be out of place. Still, the fear lingered, and I couldn't help but feel that he had been there, inside my home. For weeks after that night, I lived in a state of constant anxiety. I changed my routine, took different routes to work, and avoided the theater at all costs. But the fear never left me. Every time I saw someone in a red jacket, my heart would skip a beat, and I would have to remind myself that it wasn't him. But deep down, I knew that the man in the red jacket was still out there, somewhere, waiting for the right moment to strike again. It was a rainy Saturday afternoon, and I decided to escape the dreary weather by catching a matinee at an old movie theater in town. The theater had been around for decades, and it had a certain nostalgic charm with its vintage marquee and Art Deco design. I had been there a few times before, but this visit felt different. The rain had kept most people indoors, so the theater was nearly empty when I arrived. I bought my ticket and some popcorn, then made my way to the auditorium. As I entered, I noticed that there were only a few other people scattered around the large room. I chose a seat near the center, where I could have the best view of the screen. As the lights dimmed and the trailers began to play, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The theater was too quiet, even for a sparsely attended matinee. There was no rustling of candy wrappers or whispers between friends, just an eerie, oppressive silence. I glanced around the room and noticed that the other moviegoers were sitting unnaturally still, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of the screen. It was as if they were frozen in place, completely absorbed by the images in front of them. I tried to brush off the unease and focused on the movie, but the feeling of something being wrong lingered. About 20 minutes into the movie, I became aware of a faint sound coming from the back of the auditorium. It was so quiet at first that I thought I was imagining it, but as the minutes passed, it grew louder. It was the sound of someone moving around, shuffling through the rows of seats. But when I turned to look, there was no one there. The sound seemed to be coming from the projection booth, but the small window was dark, and I couldn't see anyone inside. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I realized that the movements weren't random. They were deliberate, purposeful, like someone was pacing back and forth. The sound continued, and I started to feel a sense of dread creeping over me. I couldn't concentrate on the movie anymore, my mind racing with thoughts of what could be causing the noise. I tried to convince myself that it was just the projectionist moving around, maybe adjusting the film or fixing something in the booth. But the way the sound echoed through the empty theater made it hard to believe. I glanced around again and noticed that the other patrons were still sitting perfectly still, their eyes glued to the screen. It was as if they hadn't noticed the noise at all, or worse, as if they were purposely ignoring it. I was about to get up and leave when the movie suddenly stopped, the screen going black. The silence that followed was deafening, and for a moment, I just sat there, staring at the dark screen, unsure of what to do. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement at the back of the theater. I turned quickly, my heart pounding in my chest, and saw a figure standing in the shadows near the projection booth. The figure was tall and thin, and it was just standing there, watching me. I couldn't make out any details, but I could feel its gaze on me, cold and piercing. Panic surged through me, and I knew I needed to get out of there. I grabbed my things and stood up, my hands shaking as I tried to steady myself. The figure didn't move, just continued to watch me as I made my way to the exit. The door seemed impossibly far away, and with every step I took, the sense of dread grew stronger. I could feel the figure's eyes on me the whole time, but I didn't dare look back. As I reached the door, I hesitated for just a moment, glancing back over my shoulder. The figure was gone, but the projection booth window was now illuminated, a faint light spilling out into the darkened theater. My breath caught in my throat, and I bolted out of the auditorium. The lobby was empty, and the only sound was the rain pounding against the windows. I hurried to the front desk, intending to report what I had seen, but when I reached the counter, there was no one there. The theater seemed deserted, as if everyone had left while I was in the auditorium. I called out, but my voice echoed off the walls, the sound swallowed by the oppressive silence. I felt a wave of fear wash over me, and I knew I had to leave. Without another word, I rushed out the front doors and into the rain, not stopping until I was safely in my car. As I sat in the driver's seat, trying to catch my breath, I looked back at the theater. The neon sign above the entrance flickered weakly, casting a dim glow over the empty street. I half expected to see the figure standing in the doorway, watching me, but the entrance was empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even from a distance. The rain continued to pour down, and I could barely see through the windshield as I pulled away from the curb. The theater disappeared from view, but the sense of unease stayed with me. For days after the incident, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened in that theater. I tried to tell myself that it was just my imagination, that the figure in the projection booth was just a trick of the light or a shadow cast by something in the room. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. There was something wrong with that theater. Something that I couldn't explain. I avoided the area for weeks, refusing to even drive by, afraid that the figure would be waiting for me if I did. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to do some research on the theater. What I found only added to my fear. Years ago, the projectionist who worked there had died under mysterious circumstances. He had been found in the projection booth, slumped over the equipment, with no apparent cause of death. Some said it was a heart attack, while others whispered that something more sinister had happened. The theater had changed hands several times since then, but the story persisted, passed down by those who had worked there over the years. The projectionist was said to still haunt the theater, silently watching the movies he had once shown. I never went back to that theater, and I never told anyone what I had seen. But the memory of that day still haunts me, especially on rainy afternoons, when I find myself thinking about that darkened auditorium and the silent figure standing in the shadows. I don't know what I encountered that day, but I'm certain that whatever it wasn't of this world. The old theater may still stand, showing movies to those brave enough to enter, but I'll never set foot inside it again. The silent projectionist can keep his watch. I've had more than enough of his company.